Sorry, one sec. Okay, so let me just start. And first of all, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your interest in Teresa pre-commercial procurement, PCP. We really appreciate you being here and trying to understand what we are trying to do, and maybe even submitting a tender when the time is due. To do that, what we want to do in this short section of this today's session is to explain what pre-commercial procurement is and its legal framework. Just for you to know, there was a session last Thursday. It's fully recorded. It goes more into detail on innovation procurement, both approaches, and so on. So if this is something appealing to you, I highly encourage you to check that recording. But today, don't worry if you weren't present there and if you don't have a knowledge on this, because what we are going to do is really briefly explain what pre-commercial procurement is, which is what Teresa PCP is all about. Really briefly, the legal framework, then the different phases of a PCP, not just Teresa PCP, how to progress from one phase to the other, and if you decide to submit a tender, how do you submit a tender and how are you going to be evaluated, so that you really understand what challenges will you be facing in due time. So without further ado, let me just start explaining what is pre-commercial procurement and its legal framework. So in a PCP, in a pre-commercial procurement, public buyers purchase R&D services to develop a solution. This is very important because in PCP, we are not purchasing supplies, we are not purchasing works, we are just purchasing the R&D services necessary to develop a solution. Because what happens is that a public buyer had a need, as Sandra was presenting, and realized that the market didn't have a solution yet for their need. So we need to buy the development of that solution, and that is done under a pre-commercial procurement. What are the characteristics of this procurement approach? Because this is procurement, this is also very important. This is not a grant, this is not a subsidy, we are talking about public procurement here. So the characteristics of this type of public procurement is that we have a competitive development in phases. What does this mean in practice? So in practice, this means, and now I'm going to bring it back to Teresa pre-commercial procurement, what happens is that for phase one, we will invite 5 suppliers to design a solution. These 5 suppliers, we will have a time frame to design this solution, and we'll have a maximum allocated budget. Then the successful ones, so the ones that successfully design the solution, will be invited to submit a tender for phase 2, to submit a proposal for phase 2. And the selected ones, 3 of them, will actually develop the prototype based on the designed solution. As you can see, the technology readiness level of the solution was very low at the beginning, so it means that a lot of R&D was necessary for the solution to make it to the market. But now, in this competitive phased approach, we are little by little increasing the technology readiness level. The successful candidates, the successful contractors for phase 2 will be invited to submit a proposal and then to actually test the prototype that they have developed in phase 2. At the end of phase 3, we will have a working prototype in real-life environment, meaning that the solution, it's really close to the market. We are talking technology readiness level 7, 8. That's very high. And here it's where PCP stops. So pre-commercial procurement stops once we have a working prototype. Because if we want to purchase commercial volumes, we need to launch another procurement procedure. So Teresa PCP will stop once we have a solution that works in the hospitals of our public buyers and that tackle hospital wastewater and the toxic substances that Andrew mentioned. Another very important characteristic, really interesting for suppliers, is the risk-benefit sharing approach. In practice, this means that in general, in PCPs, intellectual property rights are allocated to the party that develops them, meaning the supplier. So the supplier keeps the ownership of the intellectual property rights, and in exchange for the price paid, the public buyers receive a license to use the solution up until the point that it's developed during the pre-commercial procurement. So maximum TRL 8, okay? So that's how it works in practice. So now we understand what pre-commercial procurement is. We know the main characteristics. What is the legal framework? So what is our regulation? Well, the thing is that pre-commercial procurement, if complying with these characteristics, falls outside the scope of the European Public Procurement Directives. So that means that we have a little bit more leeway to ask, for example, for companies to be located in Europe or to actually perform the R&D services in Europe, develop their solutions in Europe. However, this does not mean that we can do whatever we want. That is definitely not the case. We are always bound by the general principles of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union, mainly transparency, equal treatment, non-discrimination, and proportionality. So we always have to implement these principles. There is also a communication from the Commission already from 2007, so as you can see, fairly old, explaining what is pre-commercial procurement, the characteristics, and how to implement that. And of course, we are bound to that. We have to implement this communication. It also has a Commission staff-related working document, further explaining pre-commercial procurement. And this all is very important because if we are complying with all the characteristics and we are exempted from the public procurement directives, pre-commercial procurement does not fall under state aid. So another key concept. Okay, so far we understand what is pre-commercial procurement. We understand the characteristics of pre-commercial procurement. We know what the legal framework of pre-commercial procurement is. How do the phases of a PCP work, and how do we progress from one phase to the next as suppliers? So as I was telling you, what happens and what will happen in Teresa PCP is that we will allocate certain periods of time to execute each of the phases. You have here the indicative time frame. I am saying indicative because, as you know, now, we are currently conducting the open market consultations. And one of the questions that we are asking the market, that we are asking you, it's the feasibility of the timeline and the feasibility of the budget. Because, of course, we are bounded by a strict deadline, but it's an overall deadline. So, for example, if we decide that for the phase one, the solution design, we need 4 months, that's fine. Then maybe we can reduce phase 2 or reduce phase 3. See what I mean? So this is not just fixed, it's just for you to understand more or less how it will work and what we have envisaged so far. What will happen again is that in phase 1, 5 suppliers, ideally 5 suppliers, will design this solution. They will have a maximum budget of 20K per contractor. So per contractor, it's important. Bear that in mind because when you are submitting your tender, you're bound by that maximum budget, okay? Do not overstep that budget by phase. The successful ones will be invited to develop a prototype. This prototype will be developed in the premises of 2 Spanish hospitals. That's Consorcio Hospitalario de Vic and Servicio Andaluz de Salud. And then the successful ones will actually test this prototype that was developed and tested in lab conditions in the hospitals that are participating in Teresa PCP. Here we will have 2 suppliers. So the idea is that in phase 3, we will actually be testing 2 solutions. Okay, so as you can see, we are moving forward from phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and reducing the number of competitors and the solution, and actually increasing the budget for each of these competitors. More on that. Now we are currently conducting the open market consultations, meaning that in parallel, we are defining our requirements, we are updating our state-of-the-art analysis to really understand what the market already has to offer. We are conducting a business case to understand the budget allocation, to understand what we can also ask and expect from the market and what the buyers expect as well. And we are preparing our tender documentation. Once we have done all these, we will duly publish this, and you will have all the information and all the tender documents. It is very important that you read these tender documents carefully, particularly tender document 1, which is the request for tender, and which will explain to you the rules of the game, meaning how to participate in Teresa PCP and what is expected of you in Teresa PCP in each of the phases. And then you will need to check and sign, if you're selected, the framework agreement and the phase the specific phase contract. And let me go back to the framework agreement. The framework agreement, it's what we call an umbrella contract because it covers the 3 phases of the PCP. Let me give you an example with Teresa PCP. Imagine you're selected for phase 1. So you're selected for phase 1 and then you sign a framework agreement and a phase 1 contract. If you make it to phase 2, meaning that you have successfully completed phase 1 and that you have received an invitation for phase 2 and you submit an offer and that is positively evaluated, the framework agreement will remain valid. You will just need to sign a phase 2 contract. And same thing goes for phase 3. If you are one of the lucky candidates that make it to phase 3, what will happen is that the framework agreement will remain valid and you will just sign a phase 3 contract, okay? So as you can see, framework agreement covers all the phases. You just need to sign the relative contract for the phase. If you don't make it from phase 1 to phase 2, it's fine. The framework agreement together with the phase 1 contract will be terminated. That's how it works, okay? So that's how you make it from one phase to the next. If you have noticed, I have kept saying successfully completed, successfully completed, successfully completed. Why? Because I really need you to understand, don't worry, this will also be fully explained with details and with examples in the tender documents. But just for you to understand, there is a difference between satisfactory completion of a phase and successful completion of a phase, in the sense that if you have satisfactorily completed the phase, this means that you have submitted all your deliverables in time, you have done the work that you promised you would do, you have allocated the monies to the work that you promised you would do, so you have satisfactorily completed the phase. And that means that you will receive all the funds and all the payments that are due in exchange of our correctly done work. However, to be invited to the next phase, we want you to go the extra mile, in the sense that you need to successfully complete the phase, meaning that the R&D results that you are showcasing to us are promising. And that's also something that we will explain in the tender documents, don't worry about that. But it's kind of going the extra mile, and then you will receive an invitation to submit a proposal for the upcoming phase, okay? So important, let's differentiate between satisfactory and successful completion, which is the extra mile. Okay, so you understand now what is pre-commercial procurement, its legal framework, the different PCP phases, how we move on from one phase to the next. Okay, but now how do I participate? How are you going to evaluate me firsthand? That's a really good question, and that's what we are going to deal in this last part of the presentation. Just for the sake of the explanation, in general, what we do is kind of 2 macro stage evaluation, in the sense that in the first macro step, what we do is evaluate the tenderer, so the company. We are evaluating you as a company, if we can work with you because you are also able to deliver the work, okay? And then in the second macro step, what we do is evaluate the tender. So now that we know that you are reliable and that we can work with you, we are going to evaluate your proposal of work. And we are going to do that in several steps. So in order to evaluate the companies, in order to evaluate you as a supplier, we are going to check eligibility, we are going to check exclusion criteria, and we are going to check selection criteria. Under eligibility, what are we checking? Since this is a pre-commercial procurement, and we have a little bit more leeway to ask for European companies or companies from the European Economic Area, and we can also ask for a performance in Europe. Under eligibility, we check that indeed is the case. So we normally will ask you to submit your registry in the Chamber of Commerce of a country located in Europe or in the European Economic Area, together with a self-declaration. Normally, we use a European single procurement document. That's the idea for Teresa PCP. We will also explain how you need to fill this in and where you need to fill this in. Don't worry about that. But yeah, that's what you will need to check. It is a self-declaration that helps us understand where you are located. We have checked that, so we move on now to exclusion criteria. In exclusion criteria, with this, what we are trying to check is that you're not a criminal, you're not a terrorist, you are not money laundering, you have paid your taxes, you have properly conducted procurement procedures in the past. Don't worry, we are not going to ask you to submit a lot of documentation. This is also a self-declaration that it's part of the European single procurement document that I just mentioned. The only thing is that we reserve the right to check that you are telling the truth. But in principle, you just need to fill in the European single procurement document. So we have checked eligibility, exclusion criteria, and we move forward to selection criteria. In selection criteria, what we want to check is if you as a company have the capability, the knowledge, the skills, and the experience to deliver the contract, to deliver the subject matter of the contract. How do we check that? Very simple. We will ask you for reference projects. So I've worked doing that in the last 5 years. I have this personnel working for me and they have this experience. So you will need to submit some CVs, these kind of things. Again, it will be duly explained in the tender documents. You will find a table clearly explaining what you need to submit to prove each of these selection criteria. So as you can see now, we have already assessed that you as a company are reliable and that we can work with you for this project. So now we will move on to check your tender. How do you plan to address the challenge under Teresa PCP? And for that, we will first check the compliance criteria. Compliance criteria just helps us to understand if we are indeed purchasing R&D services. We will do that checking your budget, because of course in your budget you will need to indicate what are R&D services, if you're using supplies, what kind of things you're proposing to use and where you're allocating the money. And if over 50% of your budget goes to different activities that are not R&D, we will know that this is not R&D services, okay? Again, it will be also clarified in detail in the tender documents. Do not panic, you will see that. But just for you to know, this is something that we check. We will also check that you are indeed going to perform the contract in Europe or a European Economic Area country. How do we do that? Well, we will ask you, for example, to submit proof that you have testing locations or developing locations, labs in Europe. How do we do that? Well, for example, you can send the renting invoice from your lab. Okay, we will also clarify that. I'm just giving you examples here, but don't worry, because in the tender documents we explain everything and how can you prove everything. Plus, you will have the possibility to ask as many questions as you want. We really like questions, so if you have questions, always more than welcome. Once we have checked compliance criteria, we will move on to pass-fail award criteria. Pass-fail award criteria are absolutely mandatory requirements that all tenders, all proposals need to comply with, meaning that we want the solution to have these functional and technical requirements. If your tender does not address them, we cannot select. Okay, that's different from the weighted award criteria, because in the weighted award criteria, we are going to include things that are nice to have, that we would like the solution to have. So we will give you additional points if you have that. But that doesn't mean that if you don't have them, you are excluded. Okay, so it's just going the extra mile, getting the extra points. So now you know how are we going to evaluate you. As you have heard, there is a lot of documentation to be submitted, and we know that that can be complex. So that's why in your tender documents, you will always find a checklist of documents and proof. So you will have a list of all the tender documents, what the tender document does, and if you need to take action there. And then you will have another checklist indicating what kind of documentation you need to submit and where. Let me explain that. As you can see here, I am saying envelope A, envelope B, envelope C. First, let me tell you that you will not be submitting letters. We are not doing paper anymore. It's just taxonomy, okay? Under public procurement, we call envelope A, envelope B, envelope C, the electronic archives that you need to separately submit with different documentation. Under envelope A, we are talking about administrative aspects. Here is the first macro stage. Here, you are going to submit all the documents that I need, so to check eligibility, to check exclusion criteria, and to check selection criteria, to understand if I can work with you, if you're a reliable company and you comply with my administrative requirements. So that means trade register, European single procurement document, if you're working in consortia, a consortia statement, the reference of the cases in which you have participated to prove that you have this experience and that you can work with us, the CVs of your staff so that we know that you have the knowledge and the skills and the capabilities to deliver the project. And of course, we were saying, I want you to actually develop the solution in Europe. How do you do that? How do we check that? Well, prove that you have testing facilities in Europe. That's also going to be submitted here. Then we will have envelope B, which is the technical envelope. You will find here a technical form, including self-declaration, in which we will be able to check the compliance criteria, the pass-fail hour criteria, and the weighted hour criteria. Also, don't worry, because this will be fully explained in the tender documents and in info sessions, okay? And again, if you have questions, we really like questions. Once we publish the tender documents, we are expecting your questions and we will reply to all of them, okay? Please also check deadlines, because that's also something that has happened in some other projects. People ask questions after the deadline and then it's a problem. So once we publish the tender documents, please immediately check when is the deadline of the Q&A, and just then ask all the questions that you have. We will reply to all of them. And the last envelope is the envelope C, the financial one, because of course I need to understand what is your proposed budget. Again, please make sure that this budget is within the frame, within the limits of the allocated budget per contractor per phase that we just discussed. Okay, so for example, in phase 1, as it is said right now, do not overstep the 20K thresholds, because that is a cause for exclusion. Don't worry, you will also see that, because we have prepared already, agreed, where you can indicate all your cost, personnel cost, R&D cost, and so on. So it's all really clear. And then in the end, you just need to indicate your budget per phase, and it's really easy for you to check, compare your budget and then the maximum budget per phase. So we are trying to really make it as intuitive as possible, because of course we understand this is not easy. It's a lot of documentation, it's a complex procedure, so we are trying to make it as easy as possible for you already in the tender documents, already in these sessions. And of course, if you have questions, we do understand that you have questions. Come back to us, ask as many questions as you want. Also use the possibility to ask as many questions as you want today, because we will be answering all of them and then making a recap of them, of the questions. Yes, I think this is my last slide, and then I will just let other people explain to you more things about Teresa PCP. But what we want you to understand is that ideally we will award 5 phase 1 contracts. We will award this five phase 1 contract. Please, 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 this is super important. It is not possible to jump in phase 2 or phase 3, meaning that only participants of phase 1 can participate in phase 2 and phase 3. So if you want to participate and you think that you have already a solution design, that's great, but still submit your proposal now, because we are not reopening competition for phase 2 and phase 3, okay? If you decide not to participate to phase 1, you will not be able to participate on a later stage. You will actually be able to participate once PCP Teresa is over, if we launch a procurement procedure to buy commercial volumes. But that's another thing, okay? Just bear that in mind. And that's really all on my side.